Cold fries. Loaded gun. In August 2022, 23-year-old Matthew Webb was working a routine afternoon shift at a McDonald's in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. He was a young man doing an ordinary job on an ordinary street, standing behind a counter in a fast food restaurant on Fulton Street, one of the most heavily trafficked commercial corridors in the borough. The McDonald's on Fulton Street was a busy location. Customers moved in and out throughout the day. Workers took orders, filled bags, ran fryers, and managed the steady churn of a high-volume urban restaurant. Webb was part of that crew, 23 years old, performing the job in front of him. Nothing about that day distinguished itself from any other until Lisa Fulmore placed her order and received her food. Fulmore's French fries were cold. That was the complaint. Not a missing item, not a billing error, not a health concern. Cold French fries. For most customers, that interaction ends with a replacement order or a refund at the counter. For Fulmore, it became something else entirely. She processed the cold fries as a deliberate act of disrespect. In her view, the employees were mocking her, dismissing her, intentionally insulting her standing as a customer. The kitchen had made an error in food temperature, and Fulmore translated that error into a personal attack on her dignity. She screamed at the staff. The dispute escalated inside the restaurant, loud enough that it became a public scene on one of Brooklyn's busiest retail blocks. Rather than accepting a refund or leaving, Fulmore made a phone call. She called her 20-year-old son, Michael Morgan, and told him to come to the restaurant. She wanted backup. She wanted her grievance validated through presence and force. Morgan arrived at the McDonald's on Fulton Street. The dispute had by then moved outside onto the sidewalk. Webb, still on the clock, was standing outside the restaurant when Morgan approached. Morgan drew a semi-automatic handgun. He pursued Webb down the sidewalk. Then he shot him directly in the neck. Webb was struck by a single gunshot wound to the neck on the sidewalk outside his workplace. The shooting occurred in a public space, on a commercial street, in the middle of the day. Bystanders were present. The area around the restaurant became a crime scene. Emergency responders arrived. Webb was transported for medical treatment. His injuries were severe. He was placed on life support following the shooting. He remained on life support for several days before he died. Matthew Webb was pronounced dead from a gunshot wound to the neck. He was 23 years old. Michael Morgan was charged with second-degree murder, fired through the door. On June 2, 2023, 35-year-old Ajike Owens, known to her community as AJ, walked across a shared grassy field outside her apartment complex in Ocala, Florida, to knock on the door of her neighbor's unit. She was a mother. She had children. She was on foot, unarmed, and holding her phone. She did not make it back across the field. The shared green space outside the apartment complex in Ocala was common ground. It was not assigned to any single unit. Residents and their children used it as a general outdoor area, the kind of space where kids played in the afternoon while adults kept an eye from nearby. That was ordinary. That was how the space functioned. 58-year-old Susan Lawrence had decided the space was hers. Over a period of several months, Lawrence had been aggressively policing the field as though it were her private lawn. She screamed at the neighborhood children who played there. She directed racial slurs at them. She treated their presence on common ground as a personal violation, something to be stopped, punished, and controlled. On June 2, 2023, Lawrence's behavior escalated into direct physical contact with the children. She threw heavy roller skates at a 10-year-old boy. She swung an umbrella at the kids. Then she retreated inside her apartment unit and locked the door behind her. Owens, the children's mother, had seen enough. She walked across the field toward Lawrence's unit. She walked to the front door. She knocked firmly on the closed door to demand accountability for what Lawrence had done to her children. Lawrence did not open the door. She did not call law enforcement to report someone at her door. She did not look through a window or peephole to assess who was standing outside. She picked up a handgun, aimed it at the center of the wooden front door panel, and fired through the closed door without seeing her target. The bullet passed through the wood and struck Owens in the chest. Owens' 9-year-old son was standing beside her in the doorway when the shot was fired. Emergency responders arrived at the scene. Owens had sustained a gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range through a closed door. The injuries were severe. Owens died from the wound. Ajike Owens was pronounced dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. She was 35 years old. Susan Lawrence attempted to invoke Florida's Stand Your Ground law as a defense. A jury rejected it. Owens had been unarmed and was holding nothing but her phone. Lawrence was convicted of manslaughter with a firearm and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Mask mandate execution. In May 2020, 43-year-old Calvin Munnerlin was working his post as a security guard at a Dollar Tree store in Flint, Michigan. His job was straightforward. He stood at the entrance, managed customer flow, and enforced in-store policy. In May 2020, store policy included a face covering requirement backed by both corporate directive and Michigan state law. Emergency public health mandates were in effect across the state. Munnerlin enforced them for every customer who walked through the door. The Dollar Tree in Flint was a standard retail location, shelves stocked with household goods, cleaning supplies, and food items. A checkout area near the front, security positioned at the entrance to ensure compliance with the rules that governed access to the building during the height of the public health emergency. Calvin Munnerlyn, known to those close to him as Duper, had worked that post through the early weeks of the mandates. He knew the policy. He applied it consistently. On the day in question, 45-year-old Charmel Teagle arrived at the Dollar Tree with her daughter. Her daughter was not wearing a face covering. Munnerlyn informed Teagle that a mask was required to enter the store. The requirement applied to everyone. It was not targeted. It was not personal. It was the rule. Teagle did not accept it as a rule. She processed the requirement as a direct challenge to her personal freedom, a violation of her authority as a customer, an act of aggression against her. She screamed at Munnerlyn. She stepped directly into his face. She spat on him. Then she made 2 phone calls. She called her husband, Larry Teagle, and her son, Ramonia Bishop. She told them that the security guard had been physically aggressive toward her. That claim was false. Munnerlyn had done nothing physical. He had enforced a mask policy and stood at his post. But the call had already been made, and the story had already been planted. Larry Teagle and Ramonia Bishop drove to the Dollar Tree. They entered the store armed. They walked across the sales floor to where Calvin Munnerlyn was performing his job duties. They shot him in the back of the head. Munnerlyn was struck by a gunshot wound to the back of the head while working his shift. He died from his injuries. Emergency response arrived at the scene, but the damage was not survivable. Calvin Munnerlyn was pronounced dead. He was 43 years old. Larry Teagle and Ramonia Bishop were both convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and received mandatory sentences of life without the possibility of parole. Charmel Teagle was also prosecuted in connection with the killing. Refund wasn't enough. In August 2020, 22-year-old Desmond Joshua was working inside a Burger King in Orange County, Florida. He was in his first week of employment. The job was new. The routine was new. He was learning the rhythms of the position, working the counter, managing orders, and navigating a busy drive-through lane during a period when fast food restaurants were handling some of the highest customer volumes of the pandemic era. The Burger King in Orange County was a standard location on a commercial corridor, a drive-through lane running alongside the building, a service window, a crew managing orders and timelines and customer expectations simultaneously. Joshua was part of that crew, 1 week into the job, doing the work in front of him. 31-year-old Ashley Mason pulled into the drive-through lane and encountered a long queue. She did not wait. She launched into a profanity-laced tirade directed at Joshua and the other employees, visible through the window. The complaint was the wait time. The language was not measured. She screamed at a first-week employee over the pace of a drive-through line. A manager stepped in. The manager offered Mason a full cash refund, covering the entire value of her order. She was also told to leave the property. The transaction was canceled. The matter should have been over. Mason pulled out of the lane but did not leave. She parked her vehicle across the parking lot and called her partner, Kelvis Rodriguez Tormes. She told him what had happened. Rodriguez Tormes came to the Burger King. He approached Desmond Joshua and placed him in a severe headlock. The choking was sustained. Bystanders at the scene physically intervened, breaking up the attack and separating Rodriguez Tormes from Joshua. Joshua was released from the hold. Rodriguez Tormes walked to his truck. He opened it, retrieved a handgun, and returned. He shot Joshua squarely in the chest. Joshua sustained a gunshot wound to the chest in the parking lot of the restaurant where he had been working his first week. Emergency responders arrived at the scene. The injuries were severe. Joshua died from the wound. Desmond Joshua was pronounced dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. He was 22 years old. Kelvis Rodriguez Tormes was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 50 years in state prison. 911 is a weapon. In January 2019, Dennis Tuttle and Rogina Nicholas were living in their home on Harding Street in Houston, Texas. Tuttle was 59 years old. Nicholas was 58. They were a middle-aged couple living in a residential neighborhood, occupying a private home on an ordinary block in the city. Patricia Garcia lived next door. The relationship between Garcia and her neighbors had deteriorated into a bitter, entrenched dispute. The specific origins of the conflict were not publicly detailed, but by January 2019, Garcia had decided she wanted to do something about it. She chose to use the municipal infrastructure of law enforcement as her instrument. Garcia called 911, not once, but multiple times. Each call contained fabricated information. She told dispatchers that heavily armed drug dealers were operating out of the couple's home. She claimed that sleepy juice and rock candy were being distributed from the address in large quantities. She told dispatchers that her daughter was being held hostage inside by the dealers. Garcia did not have a daughter. Every element of the emergency scenario she described was invented. There were no armed dealers inside the house. There was no hostage. There was no distribution network. There were two middle-aged people living in their home on a residential street. A narcotics officer received the call information and used it to construct an affidavit. The affidavit was later found to be fraudulent, built on Garcia's fabricated account. The affidavit was used to obtain a high-risk no-knock raid warrant for the Harding Street address. Officers approached the home with firearms drawn. They breached the front door. Tuttle and Nicholas, confronted with armed men forcing their way through their front door in the middle of the night, believed they were being subjected to a home invasion. They attempted to defend themselves. A chaotic exchange of gunfire broke out inside the home. Both Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas were killed in the shooting. The FBI launched a federal investigation into the raid. The investigation traced the origin of the entire chain of events back to Garcia's phone calls. Her fabricated reports had set in motion the warrant, the breach, and the deaths of two innocent people. A federal judge sentenced Patricia Garcia to 40 months in federal prison for providing false information to law enforcement. Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas were pronounced dead from gunshot wounds sustained during the raid. Tuttle was 59. Nicholas was 58. $35 homicide. In December 2018, 51-year-old Ngok Q Nguyen was working at Crystal's Nail and Tail Salon in Las Vegas, Nevada. She was a co-owner of the business. The salon provided nail care services in a commercial space in the city, and on the day in question, Nguyen was on the floor when 21-year-old Crystal Whipple came in and requested a manicure. The service took approximately 1 hour. At the end of the appointment, Whipple was presented with a bill of $35. She offered a payment card. It was declined. She offered another. It was declined again. The attempts continued, and the result was the same each time. The balance of $35 remained unpaid. Whipple told Nguyen that she would go out to her car to retrieve cash. It was the explanation of someone stepping away briefly to resolve a billing issue. Nguyen waited. Whipple did not retrieve cash. She ran to a black Chevrolet Cruze parked outside, got in, and started the ignition. Nguyen understood immediately what was happening. She moved out of the salon and toward the vehicle. She placed her hands on the hood of the car, standing in front of it, physically blocking Whipple from driving away without settling the $35 balance. Whipple pressed the accelerator. The car moved forward into Nguyen with force. Nguyen was thrown up onto the hood of the vehicle. As Whipple accelerated out of the parking area and into traffic, Nguyen was dragged beneath the wheels down the asphalt. Nguyen sustained injuries from the initial impact of the vehicle, the force of being thrown onto the hood, and the contact with the road surface as the car moved over her. The injuries were severe. She died from the wounds she sustained outside the salon. Whipple left Las Vegas. Her departure triggered a federal manhunt. She was located and apprehended in Phoenix, Arizona. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in state prison. Ngok Q Nguyen was pronounced dead from injuries sustained in the vehicle incident. She was 51 years old. Good Samaritan shot dead. In December 2023, 30-year-old Tamanika Woods walked into a McDonald's in Atlanta, Georgia, and encountered a situation already in progress. She was a customer. She was also a mother of 4. She knew one of the employees working the counter that day. What she did next cost her her life. The McDonald's in Atlanta was a busy urban location with a service counter, register lanes, and a partition separating the kitchen crew from the customer floor. On the day in question, the restaurant was staffed and open for business in the middle of an ordinary shift. Tamanika Woods was present as a customer, not as an employee, and had no official role in what was unfolding. 19-year-old Tania Evans had come in with her sisters. She had discovered a missing item in her fast food order. The missing item was minor. It did not require an escalation. It required a correction at the counter, a process that takes less than 2 minutes in any functional fast food environment. Evans did not ask for a correction. She and her sisters launched into a violent verbal and physical assault against the counter workers. They screamed at the employees. They hurled items from the customer side of the counter over the partition and into the kitchen workspace. The attack on the staff was sustained and escalating. Tamanika Woods saw her friend being cornered and assaulted. She stepped forward from the customer area to intervene and stop what was happening to the employee. A physical altercation broke out between the customers near the register lanes. Evans reached into her waistband. She drew a handgun. She walked toward Woods and fired at close range directly into her chest. Woods sustained a close-range gunshot wound to the chest on the customer floor of the restaurant. The injuries were severe. Woods died from the wound. Evans attempted to flee the McDonald's after the shooting. A bystander tackled her before she could exit. She was taken into custody at the scene. Tamanika Woods was pronounced dead from a close-range gunshot wound to the chest. She was 30 years old and a mother of 4. Tania Evans was booked on charges of malice murder and aggravated assault. Coworkers correction, fatal cost. In October 2017, 49-year-old Lorraine Faison was working a shift at a Burlington coat factory in Taylor, Michigan. She was on the floor with her coworker, 49-year-old Sandra Lynette Waller. Both women were employees of the same store, working the same shift, performing the same general duties in a retail environment that required consistent adherence to corporate procedures for processing merchandise. The Burlington Coat Factory in Taylor was a large retail space, the kind with long aisles of hanging garments, a processing area for incoming stock, and a back inventory room separate from the main floor where employees handled merchandise before it reached the sales area. Both Faison and Waller were familiar with the store's systems and procedures. At some point during the shift, Faison pointed out the correct corporate method for scanning merchandise tags into the store's inventory system. It was the kind of procedural clarification that happens regularly in retail environments, one employee noting the established process to another. It was not an accusation. It was not a reprimand. It was a workflow note. Waller did not receive it that way. She reacted as though the correction was a direct assault on her professional competence and standing. She exploded into a loud, sustained screaming match with Faison on the floor of the store. The confrontation was disruptive enough that a manager intervened. The manager clocked both women out of their shifts and sent them home for the day. The store's response was to remove both parties from the environment and allow things to cool down. Waller went home. She did not cool down. She spent the night in her anger over the scanning correction, processing Faison's procedural note as an unforgivable attack on her autonomy and her position in the workplace. The following morning, Waller arrived at the Burlington Coat Factory before her shift was scheduled to begin. She was carrying a concealed handgun. She did not go to the main floor. She went to the rear inventory storage room, away from the general retail space, where Faison was working. She located Faison in the storage room and shot her directly in the chest. After the shooting, Waller did not flee. She remained at the scene and waited calmly for law enforcement to arrive. Faison sustained a gunshot wound to the chest in the back storage room of the store. The injuries were severe. Emergency responders arrived. Faison died from the wound. Lorraine Faison was pronounced dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. She was 49 years old. Sandra Lynette Waller pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 18 to 42 years in state prison. Driveway at 1 a.m. on September 30th, 2024. At 1 o'clock in the morning, 56-year-old Stephen Sanders was standing on a residential street in San Antonio, Texas. He was outside near a driveway across from his neighbor's property. His neighbor was 58-year-old Anna O'Rourke. They were in the middle of an argument. It was not their first. Stephen Sanders was a known figure on his block. Neighbors and community members described him as someone who brought people together. He hosted barbecues. He built tree houses for the local children. He was the kind of resident whose presence made a neighborhood feel like a community. On his street in San Antonio, he was liked and remembered by the people around him. Anna O'Rourke had a different reputation on the same street. Over several years, she had made repeated calls to law enforcement about Sanders and other neighbors. The complaints were about ordinary neighborhood activity, the kinds of things that are simply part of living in proximity to other people. The calls had not resolved the tension. They had compounded it, building a record of hostility that stretched back years before September 30th, 2024. In the early hours of that morning, the accumulated friction between O'Rourke and Sanders broke into a direct vocal confrontation. A fierce verbal shouting match erupted between the two on the residential street. The argument was loud. It was the kind of confrontation that at 1 o'clock in the morning draws attention from the surrounding block. At some point during the exchange, O'Rourke walked away from the confrontation. She did not walk toward her front door. She walked to her car. She got in. She started the engine. She put the vehicle into drive. Sanders was standing in the driveway across the street, exposed on foot, with no cover between himself and the car. O'Rourke pressed the accelerator and steered the vehicle directly at him. The car struck Sanders with massive force, crushing him beneath the wheels. Sanders suffered catastrophic internal trauma from the impact. He did not survive. He died in the driveway on the residential street where he had lived and where his neighbors had known him. Stephen Sanders was pronounced dead from catastrophic internal trauma sustained in the vehicle strike. He was 56 years old. Anna O'Rourke was immediately arrested and booked on a formal charge of murder, suspended, then armed. On January 13th, 2021, 51-year-old Felicia Michelle Marlowe was working a shift on the active sales floor of TCS Designs, a furniture factory in Hickory, North Carolina. She had worked there alongside her coworker, 52-year-old Tangela Parker. The working relationship between the two women had deteriorated badly over the preceding months, and the cause was entirely one-sided. TCS Designs operated as a furniture manufacturing and retail facility in Hickory, a mid-sized city in western North Carolina with a significant furniture industry presence. The factory floor was a working commercial space where employees handled production, inventory, and sales operations. Marlo was a part of that workforce present that January morning to do her job. Over the months leading up to January 2021, Parker had repeatedly targeted Marlo with hostile, profanity-laced confrontations. The friction was not mutual. Parker initiated the screaming and the abuse. She did it consistently, and she did it loudly enough that the pattern became impossible for management to ignore. The behavior escalated until management reached a formal decision. Parker's conduct had made her presence on the floor untenable. She was suspended. Parker was removed from the workplace because of her own documented behavior. The suspension was a direct consequence of how she had treated her coworker. She had been told to stay away from TCS Designs. She did not stay away. On January 13th, 2021, Parker returned to the factory. She was armed. She entered the building and located Marlo on the active sales floor in the working commercial space of the furniture factory, surrounded by the ordinary environment of her regular job. Parker shot Marlo twice. Marlo was struck by 2 gunshot wounds on the factory sales floor. She died at the scene. Emergency response was called, but Marlo did not survive. Parker did not wait for law enforcement. She and her husband fled the state immediately following the shooting. They used fake names and a stolen license plate to travel and evade identification across state lines. The manhunt that followed was multi-state and extended. It ran for 6 months before U.S. Marshals located and apprehended Parker in Phoenix, Arizona. Philefia Michelle Marlo was pronounced dead at the scene from 2 gunshot wounds. She was 51 years old. Tangela Parker pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 to 25 years in state prison. Held the door, paid in blood. In 2025, 41-year-old Cecilia Simpson, known to those close to her as Cece, was leaving a shopping center in Dallas, Texas, when another customer walked through a door she was holding open. The other customer was 22-year-old Kiona Zagua Hampton. Hampton walked straight through the open door without acknowledging the gesture. Simpson said something about it. She called out Hampton's lack of basic courtesy. It was a brief, ordinary social remark of the kind people make when someone walks past without a word after a door has been held. For most people in most situations, the exchange ends there, whether with an apology, a shrug, or nothing at all. Hampton did not let it end there. She launched into a fierce verbal confrontation with Simpson in and around the shopping center. The disagreement over a door became a shouting match, escalating in intensity in a public commercial space. Simpson, recognizing that the situation was becoming dangerous, made the decision to leave. She walked to her vehicle and drove to a nearby PetSmart to remove herself from the confrontation. When she arrived inside the PetSmart, she explicitly told store employees that a hostile stranger was following her. She was not imagining the threat. She was documenting it with the people around her, out loud, in real time. Hampton followed her into the PetSmart. She entered the store and aggressively attempted to resume the confrontation. She was removed. She came back again. She entered the PetSmart a second time to continue going after Simpson. Store employees ordered both women to leave the building. In the parking lot outside the PetSmart, Hampton threw a plastic drink bottle at Simpson's car. Simpson, confronted with a sustained physical provocation, fought back to defend herself. Hampton drew a handgun from her clothing. She fired 3 shots at close range directly into Simpson's body. Simpson's teenage children were present in the parking lot when the shots were fired. Simpson sustained 3 close-range gunshot wounds. The injuries were severe. She died from her wounds. Cecilia Simpson was pronounced dead from close-range gunshot wounds sustained in the parking lot. She was 41 years old. Kiona Zachua Hampton was arrested later that evening and charged with murder, stabbed through the back door. In 2025, 39-year-old Jennifer Harris was the manager on duty at a McDonald's in East Point, Michigan. She was a single mother of 6 children. On the day in question, she was overseeing the shift and managing the crew working under her supervision. One of those crew members was 26-year-old Afeni Badu Muhammad. The McDonald's in East Point was a standard location. A drive-through window running along one side of the building, a rear service entrance accessible from outside the main customer-facing area, and a kitchen and crew workspace that sat apart from the front counter and dining room. Jennifer Harris knew the layout of that building. It was her workplace. On the day Muhammad was sent home, Harris made a managerial decision that was entirely within her authority. She sent Muhammad home before the end of her scheduled shift. It was a standard disciplinary action, the kind a manager exercises when an employee's conduct or attitude on the floor reaches a threshold that requires intervention. Muhammad was told to leave. Harris continued managing the shift. Muhammad left the building but did not go home. She drove to a nearby park. What she was doing there was not confirmed in available reporting, but she did not remain there. At some point, she retrieved a large kitchen knife. She put on a hooded mask to conceal her identity. She returned to the McDonald's. She did not enter through the front door. She slipped in through a rear entrance, using the back access point of the building to avoid being seen by the front counter staff or any customers in the restaurant. She moved through the building to find Harris. She located her manager and attacked her with the knife. She stabbed Harris up to 15 times. A customer sitting in the drive-thru lane witnessed the attack from outside the building. The customer was licensed to carry a concealed firearm. The customer fired a warning shot to interrupt the assault. Muhammad stopped. The customer exited the vehicle, drew the firearm, and held Muhammad at gunpoint in the parking lot outside the restaurant until law enforcement arrived on the scene. Harris had sustained up to 15 stab wounds during the attack. The injuries were severe. She was transported for medical treatment but did not survive. Harris died from her injuries. Jennifer Harris was pronounced dead from multiple stab wounds. She was 39 years old and a mother of 6. Afeni Badu Muhammad was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.